Hello, folks, and welcome back. This is Colonel Retired Chris Wyatt, U.S. Army. This is update on day 9 of the Russian invasion of the Ukraine. At yesterday's diplomatic meeting on Thursday, the 3rd of March, 2022, between Russian and Ukrainian representatives, the two sides agreed to try to create a humanitarian corridor or corridors to evacuate civilians in their second round of talks. A third round of talks is set to take place sometime next week. How many people will die needlessly between now and then? Russia's parliament has reportedly passed a law imposing a jail term of up to 15 years for spreading intentionally fake information about the armed forces. Apparently, autocrats are not simply in Washington, Canberra, Wellington, Ottawa, and London, Paris. They're also in Moscow. NATO's foreign ministers agreed to not have a no-fly zone over Ukrainian territory, according to Jens Stoltenberg, the NATO Secretary General. NATO foreign ministers discussed a no-fly zone over Ukraine, but agreed that NATO planes should not operate over Ukraine airspace. Establishing a no-fly zone over the Ukraine could result in the war spreading to more European countries. Speaking to reporters in Brussels after the meeting with the NATO foreign ministers, Stoltenberg said, "We understand the desperation, but we also believe that if we did that, establishing a no-fly zone, we would end up with something that could lead to a fully fledged war in Europe involving many more countries." The allies agreed not to have NATO planes operating Ukrainian airspace or NATO troops on Ukrainian soil. Stoltenberg also said at the same time, we have responsibility as NATO allies to prevent this war from escalating beyond Ukraine, because that would be even more dangerous, more devastating, and would cause more human suffering. Stoltenberg also reports that Russia is using cluster bombs in Ukraine. He said, "We've seen the use of cluster bombs, and we have seen reports of the use of other types of weapons, which would be in violation of international law." The American embassy in the Ukraine has said that the attack on a nuclear power plant is a war crime after Russia seized control of the Ukrainian nuclear facility, the biggest in Europe. It's a war crime to attack a nuclear power plant. Putin's shelling of Europe's largest nuclear plant takes his reign of terror one step further. This in a post from the U.S. Embassy in Kiev, which of course is not in Kiev. It's no longer in the Ukraine. Once again, NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg, all over the news today on day 9, has warned that the days to come are likely to be worse, calling Russia's invasion of Ukraine the worst military aggression in Europe for decades. But he stressed NATO was a defensive alliance and not seeking war with Russia. Regarding that nuclear power plant, overnight, Russian forces seized Europe's biggest nuclear power plant in heavy fighting in southeastern Ukraine, triggering a lot of global alarm, and a huge blaze that was the training building now has been extinguished. The facility is apparently safe. Russia's defense ministry blamed the fire on monstrous attack by Ukrainian saboteurs and said its forces were in control. United States President Joe Biden and Canada's Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, the fascist in chief, also condemned Russia for shelling the plant and starting a blaze, which, as I mentioned, took place at a training building on the site's perimeter. Nine Nations Security Council will hold an emergency meeting at 11:30 Eastern Standard Time in New York today, the 4th of March, 2022. Emergency meeting has been called in response to the attack on the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, which I've been discussing moments ago. Session was requested by British Prime Minister Boris Johnson. Diplomats, according to the French press agency, say that the United States, France, Norway, Ireland, and Albania will join the call for an urgent meeting. It will also include speeches from the International Atomic Energy Agency and a UN official. The European Union wants Ukraine to become a member state as soon as possible. This, according to Commissioner Markos Sefcovic, who told this to journalists on Friday at a ministers' meeting. It's time for signaling that the Ukrainian people is one of Europe's peoples, and we want them in as soon as possible. That's what he had to say. But he added at the moment that the bloc needed to focus on short-term measures linked to the conflict. He says, "I think what is most important now is to help Ukraine in the fight." Relief agencies and the United Nations are now reporting that as many as 1.2 million people have fled from Ukraine since the invasion began 9 days ago. Many of them gone to nearby Poland. About 500,000 of these refugees are children, according to UNICEF. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky has appealed to Russians to stage protest over Russian forces' seizure of the largest nuclear power plant in Europe. The building, as I mentioned repeatedly here, the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, was set ablaze during intense fighting. The plant wasn't set ablaze. Swedish officials and others who monitor radiation levels in Europe have reported there's been no radiation leak from this attack, and that the attack was on a training building on the outskirts of the facility. CNN is reporting that the United States' closest Middle East allies yesterday condemned Russia's invasion of Ukraine in a break from their previously neutral statements and a nod to the changing nature of the war that has created over 1 million refugees in just a week. As I mentioned, at least 1.2 million now. All of the U.S.'s Gulf allies, including Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, voted in favor of a resolution in the United Nations Assembly that condemned Russia's invasion and called for its immediate withdrawal from Ukraine. Now, there has been far from balanced reporting from the media, particularly the leftist media in the West, but media in general, not reporting honestly or objectively about the events in Ukraine, and none more so than the UK's Guardian newspaper, which clearly following its norms is far from objective or neutral in its reporting analysis. Let me say that Ukraine continues to flop international norms and abusing and exploiting purported prisoners of war. In this story from The Guardian, titled "Demoralized Russian Soldiers Tell of Anger at Being Duped into War," videos of prisoners of war used for Ukrainian propaganda, but there's an authentic sense of regret among Russian servicemen. Well, that may be the case, but the focus here should be on the abuse of the Geneva Conventions and misuse of prisoners of war by Ukrainian officials. This quote, "Ask what he would tell his commanders." One Russian soldier bluntly said, "They are blank." Another phrase from used in this, "They duped us." 8 days after Vladimir Putin's invasion, it's clear that a significant number of his servicemen are demoralized and reluctant to fight. Some have given themselves up. Others have abandoned their vehicles and set off back towards Russia on foot, lugging weapons and kit bags, according to videos. These episodes do not mean the Kremlin will fail its attempts to conquer Ukraine as its tactics shift to shelling of civilians. Now, in this report, I deleted the word brutal, which is what the Guardian put into their report. Once again, far from objective source of news. Low morale among invading troops might be one reason why Russia's blitzkrieg plan to overwhelm Ukraine has been slowed. Well, let's just be honest about this, folks. Let's just be honest about this. There has been far from objective reporting in this conflict. Both sides are guilty of things that are unacceptable under the norms of international law and conduct of land warfare. That said, Russia's advance has run into many problems and challenges, not the least of which are logistical, operational pauses to refit and link up forces. But Ukraine finds itself in a perilous position, especially with the capture of this large nuclear power plant in the southeast, Kherson's capture, and with forces from the Donbass linking with troops from the Crimea. It's just a matter of time at this stage before Ukrainian troops are encircled in the northeast unless they withdraw southwest towards Kiev to make a defensive stand. The promised arms, weapons, and support for Ukraine from Western nations, we have yet to see it materialize anywhere in the Ukraine. Folks, thanks a lot for paying attention to this update. Stay tuned for more on the Ukrainian events as Russia's invasion continues in Ukraine. Thanks a lot. This is Colonel Retired Chris Wyatt. Cheers.